So continuing on from the last video, we've already shown that with a Docker file, we can right click and we can say run the Docker file. So we've already demoed that. We saw that if I just lift this up a bit, we saw that in the services tools window, we've got containers and we've got a list of all our containers. I really need to clean up my stock containers because I've got lots in there, but this is the one from the last video. From here, I can right click, I can restart it, I can pause it, I can stop it, I can debug it, I can see what image it is. So if I go to show image, it jumps down to the image view. If I go up here, these are all the images on my machine. I can create a terminal. So if I do that, then I can get a terminal within that container. And I can right click and close this. So I can do the same. So if we clicked on this, we can see the environment variables, the ports, which we saw we added manually in the last section. We can add volumes. As I mentioned in the last video, I do assume some Docker knowledge here. I do have a full Docker course from zero to hero on Dome Train. So if you're interested in learning more about Docker, I would definitely recommend checking that out. But for this video, I'm just showing the UI rather than talking about Docker concepts. So we've got environment variables, ports, volumes. I've already shown the terminal from right clicking down here, but we can click here and get a terminal. So I can browse that file system and run commands. If I do exit, then let's just close this. I've already shown that we can see images. So all images I've got downloaded on my machine. I can right click and say create a container from that image. I can right click and say show the layers of that image. And I can click on each one and see information about it. I can even push the image to a remote image registry from over here. So we can see this as great Docker support. What about Kubernetes? If I collapse this now, oh, actually, before moving over to Kubernetes, just a quick point that if I control Alt and S to get the settings up and go to plugins, which we've seen before, and let's search for Docker, we can see that both Docker and Kubernetes are bundle plugins. So you'll probably already have these installed. Oh, also before moving over to Kubernetes, let's talk about Docker Compose files. So I'm going to open up a new directory, so Control-Shift-O, and in the useful extras for this module folder, we've also got container support. So if we open up this as a directory, then there's a Docker Compose file. So all this does is just spin up a database and RabbitMQ. So you can see we've got these play buttons. I can click on this and it'll spin it up. Again, it's opened up this services. If I lift this up a bit, so it's failing saying the port is already allocated. So that would have been from when I did the database video. So if I go to containers, let's just find this one and let's just delete this one. So that was the one from the database video. And then back to the Docker Compose file. So I can do it from here, or I can right click and say run. And that's now started those two containers. Let's collapse this and expand this. I can see these two services here. So database, and this name matches the name of the service in the Docker Compose file, and likewise with RabbitMQ. And if I expand this, I can see the container. So I can click on this and see the logs, and likewise with RabbitMQ. I can go to the dashboard and see a similar view, so we can see the ports, and these have been automatically assigned because they've been referenced in the Docker Compose file. But it's a similar kind of interface that we showed earlier, and I can right click, I can restart the container, so this is the container, and stop the container, and all of these options we saw before. I can also right click on the service and say stop the service. I can scale it up, so I can have more containers of that. Very rarely you'd want to do this with Docker Compose locally, but you can do. I can right click on the top level Docker Compose file and say down, so similar to Docker Compose down. I can restart it all, which will restart all the containers. Stop will stop the containers. Down actually stops them and deletes the containers. So again, just more stuff that we can do within Rider without having to leave the IDE. So now let's have a look at Kubernetes. Just like with Docker, I've also got another Dome Train course, which is a deep dive on Kubernetes, which goes through all the concepts. So if you're interested in learning more about Kubernetes, I would recommend checking that out. So if I right click on Kubernetes, I can open up my kube configuration file automatically from here. I can add a cluster. So if I do from default directory, now I've grayed out some of these because I've got client clusters on here and personal clusters. But if I untick them all and I tick Docker Desktop, now I should point out if you've got Docker Desktop running, let's load it up. If you go to settings, you can go to Kubernetes and you can enable a local development one node cluster here to play around with. So that's what I've done. So if I say add clusters, then we can see that's now here. If I right click and connect to it, then I can expand. I can see information like my namespaces within the folder in the GitHub repository associated with this video. So that's container support. We've got deployment. Let's bring this down a bit. Then I've got a very simple Kubernetes YAML file, which does a namespace and a deployment. So you can see we've got icons in the gutter, which do things. On the right-hand side, I can apply this to the current cluster. So I can apply this YAML file to create those resources. So this is just going to be a pod, which is Nginx, called my website. If I click the apply here and set the current cluster to Docker Desktop, that's now failed because I've got to right click on here and say namespace and set the namespace to my new namespace. So let's do that and try again. So that's now created it. If I then go to workloads pod, I can see that because I've got two replicas mentioned here, I've got two pods. The deployment mentions that website. If I click on one of the pods, I can then click on the logs. So I can see the logs from that pod. I can right click. I can delete at the bottom. I don't think you can see that. I think that's off the screen. I can do port forwarding. I can get a console to show the output. I can get a shell. So I can get a shell on that pod. So I can just browse the file system and run commands. I'm not going to dig any deeper because unless you know Kubernetes, then a lot of these concepts won't make sense. But if you do know and use Kubernetes, this is actually really powerful. The same for Docker too. And as I say, I've got courses on Dome Train for both Docker and Kubernetes. So following on with the theme of doing other things in your IDE so you don't have to alt-tab to other applications, we're going to talk about terminals in this video. So we've already spoken about how we can do things like Docker and Kubernetes and Git and HTTP client and various other things while staying in your IDE. But what about the terminal? So down here, you've got this terminal button. And again, in here, if it's not pinned, or you can do Control Alt and 1. And this has opened up the terminal. Now, it's worth pointing out that this has opened up my default shell, which is PowerShell, and I use a project called OhmyPosh to customize my terminal. So when I open this up, just like if I open up my normal PowerShell terminal, I get all this stuff. It's the same in Rider. Another way I can open this is if I right-click on any file or folder, I can go to Open In, and I can say Terminal, and that will open up that folder in a Terminal tab. And as you can see, we've got multiple tabs here. I can do plus or Control-Shift-T to open up a new default terminal, or I can do the drop down and open up a different shell, even like WSL. I can also use the Alt key, so Alt and left and right, to switch between these tabs. If I do Alt and down, it gives me a drop down so I can jump to one quickly. I can even do, if I do this drop down, as well as these shells installed on my machine, I can do a new SSH session and then connect to a remote SSH server. Other cool things I can do, I can right click on a tab and say move it to the editor. So it becomes a main window up here. I can right click on a tab and say rename session so I can give it a different name. I can right click and say split. So I can do horizontal and vertical splits. And it's worth pointing out that this layout and the tabs and the names and things all get saved. So if you close the IDE and open it back up again, they will be preserved. I can also do Control F. So if we do ls, quite often when you type a command on the command line, you then pipe it to grep if you want to find something, but you can just do Control F and you can search. So if I do deployment.yaml, I can search. That's way easier than trying to grep it and that kind of thing. So let's close this so it's got a single terminal. The last thing I want to show is they've got a concept of, they call it the new terminal. If I right click and say enable new terminal, so that opens up a new tab and that's now enabled. And if I open up a new tab, that will also be using this new terminal. If I do this and settings, then we can see this option here as well. Now you'll notice that this isn't using my OhmyPosh configuration. So it doesn't look like this, like my normal terminal that I would have outside of Rider. If I want to keep that, as we saw in the settings, is similar to this, I can right click and say prompt style and I can change. So one thing you'll notice here is it's automatically added Git support and my input is on the new line. So I can right click and say prompt style if I want it on a single line, so that keeps it over here. Or I can say prompt style, the standard shell prompt. So that now looks more like I've configured using all my posh. So if you prefer to keep what you've configured, if you've done so, then this is a good way of doing that. Let's just go back to the default double line. So let's talk about more differences with this new terminal. So if I do like ls, we can see that we've got this separation between the actual input, where we can type new commands, and past commands. I don't know if you can see, I'll zoom in when editing, but you can see there's a separator here and there. And what I can do is I can press Control. In fact, let's do a few more commands. Let's have a look. Let's just do a cat of deployment.yaml. And you can see there, actually, let me go back and do that again. You can see we've got more IntelliSense than we would normally have, an auto-completion. And I'll show more of that in a sec. So that's another command. So you can see that's dumped that out. But we can see that as I'm scrolling through, it's got the separation of the different commands, the past history. I can do Control and up to jump between them. And I can do Control and down to jump back to the input area. So they call this the input area, and they refer to these different ones as the output areas. We've also got, if you've got AI Assistant installed, and we spoke about that earlier on in the course, then you can see on the right hand side there's this Ask AI Assistant, and you can do Control and /. So let's do that. So what do we have in this directory? We've got Docker Compose. So let's just say spin up Docker Compose file in this directory, only run RabbitMQ. So for transparency, I've never tried this before. Let's see what happens. And it's written the command I would expect it to do. So that's worked out quite well. If I get rid of that, and I want to show command completion now. So this is another new UI bit of functionality. If let's think of a command like git log. If I start typing git, well, as I'm typing that, you can see it's auto-completing. If I do log, you can see it's doing that. I can do --, and we can see I can choose options from a drop-down. If I did git commit, I can do --, and we can see the commit options like amend. I could do message. Oh, I didn't mean to press enter there, but you get the idea. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the Scratch files in a previous video, I think this, as well as the Scratch files, is kind of a bit Marmite. So I think you either love it or hate it. I personally don't like the way this works and would much rather have just a standard terminal. But I do really like some of the functionality, like that auto-completion is really nice. I just don't like these separate output areas and input areas. But this new terminal is fairly new, and over time they'll probably improve it. And as I've said, we've got this setting option, so you can turn it on or off depending on whether you like it or not.